Judy Batalion is the New York Times bestselling author of the highly acclaimed The Light of Days, the untold story of women resistance fighters in Hitler's ghettos. The Light of Days will be translated into 19 languages and has been optioned by Steven Spielberg. Judy is also the author of White Walls, a memoir about motherhood, as well as daughterhood and the mess in between. Her essays have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, the Forward Vogue, and many other publications. Judy will be in conversation this evening with Arthur J. Magida, who has been a professor at Georgetown University and the University of Baltimore. He is a contributing correspondent to PBS's Religion and Ethics News Weekly, a senior editor of the Baltimore Jewish Times, and environmental reporter for National Journal. Two of his highly praised books, codenamed Madeline and The Nazi Seance, have also been optioned for films. He's written for Newsweek, The Washington Post, The Washington Globe, The Jerusalem Report, among other publications. Arthur and Judy, thank you so much for being with us at the library this evening. It's such a pleasure to host you and have you.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm delighted to speak with Arthur. Honored to be here with you.
We're totally thrilled.
And now that I have unmuted, I will say exactly the same thing. It's a great treat, and it's wonderful to have this cross-Atlantic audience, and I look forward to whatever ensues.
Fantastic. So a kind of simple but fairly open-ended question to start. Judy, let's start with you. For those who haven't read The Light of Days yet, and perhaps you could hold up the beautiful cover, because as I mentioned before the event, both books have been totally checked out of the library, so I haven't even been able to read them. You can both hold up. So for those who haven't read it yet, what briefly is it about?
Sorry, they're all going to fall down now. Okay. The Light of Days is the story of Jewish women in the resistance against the Nazis in Poland, largely based in the Polish ghettos. I focus on Jewish women who took all kinds of roles in the underground, ranging from those who ran soup kitchens, underground schools, secret, even sports groups, summer camps, theater, underground printing presses. They used to smuggle the bulletins by hiding them in their braids, all the way through to Jewish women who shot Gestapo men in the head, who blew up Nazi supply trains, who were ghetto fighters, guerrilla fighters in ghetto uprisings, flinging Molotov cocktails and blowing up Nazi tanks. One of my central character, a woman named Renia Kukielka, she was what was referred to as a courier girl. And I spent quite a bit of time talking about the courier girls. And the courier girls were young Jewish women who pretended to be Christian. They performed a Christian identity and escaped the ghettos, went in and out of ghettos, connecting the locked ghettos, bringing information, bringing bulletins, bringing supplies, bringing news. Even the news of the genocide was delivered by these young Jewish women. And they also were the ones who armed the ghetto undergrounds, meeting with weapons dealers, buying guns and explosives and hiding them in fashionable handbags and taped to their torsos, smuggling them into the ghettos, and also carrying out rescue missions, helping to take Jews, adults and children out of ghettos, out of labor camps, and finding them hiding spots and then caring for them in these hiding spots. So the book addresses all these forms of Jewish female resistance in Poland through a number of different characters' stories.
Great, thank you. It was a fantastic summary for a 550-page book. Arthur, let's turn to you. Codenamed Madeline, briefly, what is it about? And having just heard Judy's description, if you noticed any kind of resonances, please go ahead and comment on them.
Certainly. Well, one quality of this encounter right now, this Zoomed encounter, that I really relish is that both Judy and I were coming to our stories from completely different perspectives and completely different intentions, and yet we both ended up being absorbed and mesmerized, if you will, by these inordinately brave women. Page 1 of Judy's book. Judy, if I may quote you, you say, "I had been searching for strong Jewish women." Well, I wrote a book about a strong Sufi woman, but I was not searching for a strong Sufi woman. I did not Google Sufi Spy Nazis Paris. Noor just came to me literally out of nowhere. Friends who make documentary films emailed me about 5-6 years ago at this point about an hour-and-a-half film that they had made for PBS. It would be on TV in about 2 weeks at that point. It's called Enemy of the Reich, and I read what they sent. Very little of it made any sense to me. In the first paragraph, they mentioned this woman I had never heard of before, who I know an awful lot about right now. Noor Inayat Khan meant nothing to me. Mentioned the agency that she worked for, top secret British agency, the SOE, Special Operations Executive. I had never heard of that. Second paragraph, it mentioned Noor's father, Hazrat Inayat Khan. Then I woke up because I was very familiar with Hazrat Inayat Khan. He was the man who brought Sufism to the West in 1910 from India. The more I delved into Noor's story, the more I realized that she was a truly spectacular woman and a truly spectacular Sufi. Noor was raised in what I call a Sufi enclave, a little cocoon directly opposite Paris. This was a spiritual community that her father had, as well as the home where the family lived. Noor's mother, I'm going to have to hold these up because it wouldn't work with my PowerPoint, unfortunately. Noor's mother was an American, or I don't know, there we go. She was an American. Her father, Hazrat Inayat Khan, was Indian, and Noor was born in Russia before the family finally settled in Saran across from Paris. While growing up, Noor wrote poetry. She wrote short stories for children. She wrote and played music splendidly. Her father died in 1927. The entire family, of course, was distraught. Noor basically was the caretaker for her 3 siblings while her mother was unable to because she was grieving for her late husband. In the mid-1930s, Noor attended the Sorbonne. She majored in child psychology, but all along, she and especially her brother, Valiant, were alarmed at the news that was coming out of Germany. They read newspapers, they had a radio in the home, and they heard every day what the Germans were doing to the countries that they occupied, to the Jews in particular in Germany, and then subsequently in other countries.
Okay,
Yep. Okay.
I'm just going to jump in and before we go through kind of a play-by-play of every single chapter, I just want to go back and ask Judy to explain the context of her protagonist, Renya, and then we can get into the war years.
If we will, thank you.
You mean the context of who she was?
Yeah,
or how I found her? Because I also had a similar, like Arthur, this was serendipity. This project found me.
Yes.
You know, I won't take too long, but I happened to be researching. I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and I was interested primarily I was thinking a lot about the generational transmission of trauma, what I call the emotional legacy of the Holocaust. I was researching these psychological questions when I happened at the British Library to come across this unusual book, an old blue woven fabric book with gold writing on the cover. It was also in Yiddish. It was called Frauen in die Ghettos, Women in the Ghettos. And I would say more unusual than the book is the fact that I speak Yiddish. And I started reading this book, and this brings me to your question. This was a book with stories of dozens and dozens of young Jewish women who had fought the Nazis and fought them, as I said, primarily from the Polish ghettos. It was a Holocaust story that I had absolutely never heard. At the center of this book, Frauen in die Ghettos, was the longest sort of excerpt, the longest chapter. And this was about a woman called Renia. I didn't even have her last name. And this was, it immediately gripped me. This was written in detailed narrative with a kind of matter-of-fact tone, even some wit. This was written in 44, 45, right as the war was ending. Renia was one of these courier girls, as I mentioned, and you asked her context. She was just turning 15 when Hitler invaded her town. She was a stenographer. She had been to school, she'd studied, she was working in the court, and she was thrown into a ghetto, imprisoned. She was defiant from the start. She used to escape from the ghetto to trade family heirlooms for food to help feed her family. She knew she was going to be killed. And in August 1942, Renia fled. She fled the ghetto, and she was by herself, running through fields and forests, eating berries and grass. She looked good. This is a big theme in the book. She could pass for being non-Jewish. And so she tried to find a life for herself in Poland. She got a job as a housemaid for a German family, undercover, going to church with them, nervously copying everyone's movements. But she really missed her sister. And she found a way to connect with her sister, her older sister. And her older sister was in this town, Bijin, in southwest Poland. At the time, was part of the Reich Annex. And her sister smuggled her over. And when Renia arrived, by this time she was 18. And the young Jews in Bijin were trying to stage a revolt. And they needed supplies and information from Warsaw, was sort of the underground headquarters. And they had these courier girls going back and forth. But they had all been killed. And they needed someone to go, someone who looked good. And they asked Renia if she would do it. And she immediately said yes. And so she became the main courier for the Bijin underground, going to Warsaw, as I said before, with fake IDs, papers, trying to make rescue plans, bringing other Jews with her and finding them hiding spots, going to the cemetery in Warsaw, buying weapons from dealers. She would tape them to her torso, hide money in her shoe, buying bullets and ammunition, hide them in their pockets, in marmalade jars, in teddy bears, and bring them back into the ghetto.
Lovely. I want to quote a brief sentence that you wrote about Renia and then ask you, Arthur, a question. So Judy, you wrote, Renia was neither an idealist nor a revolutionary, but a savvy middle-class girl who happened to find herself in a sudden and unrelenting nightmare. She rose to the occasion, fueled by an inner sense of justice and by anger. Arthur, do you think that Noor simply rose to the occasion, or was there something more going on here? I'm thinking particularly about this kind of reoccurring phrase, the joy of sacrifice, and her Sufism roots.
Yes, and that phrase, the joy of sacrifice, is actually Noor's. I would never have deigned to depict sacrifice as a joy. I do not see sacrifice as especially joyful. Noor did, because her entire life, her entire soul, her entire being centered around being of service to others. Her father, in fact, this internationally renowned spiritual teacher, a Sufi master, said that sacrificing yourself for others bathes the world, which purifies and heals the suffering of humanity. Both Noor's father and Noor herself built their lives around service. And a number of people have questioned me about how sacrifice, and in Noor's case, the ultimate sacrifice, could have been so satisfying, could have been so soul stirring. A friend of mine, a very good friend, a psychologist, was convinced while I was working on the book that Noor had a death wish. I attempted to persuade him she had no death wish, nor had a life wish. Her desire was to continue life and to respect other people and uplift other people. And toward Noor, for Noor, there's nothing depressing and nothing distressing about that. It is indeed joyful.
Lovely. Well, you know, there are differences between your book. Surely the cultural and kind of geographical differences. Judy, yours is set in Poland. Arthur, yours bridges Britain, and then SOE, you know, French resistance, kind of more classic resistance. But your protagonists are both women. And I want to ask both of you, Judy, let's go to you first. What do you think, you know, how did being a woman shape the experience of war, and how do they use it to their advantage?
Sure, that's a great question. So being a woman in the underground, women were able to do things that men weren't. Jewish women. Most Jewish women, these roles like the couriers, even some of the more, you know, roles of assassins or train saboteurs, these were women that worked on the outside, the Aryan side. They had to leave the ghettos. They had to leave camp. These were, which was not allowed for Jews. They would be killed. So women were pretending to be, these women pretended to be, as I said, Christian. They pretended to be Catholic Poles. And this was an easier performance for young women for a few reasons. One of them was Jewish women were not circumcised. So for men, if a Jewish man was on the outside and he was suspected of being Jewish, he was told to drop his pants, you know, at gunpoint. Jewish women didn't have this marker of their identity on their body. So they were freer to move, and they didn't have that fear about it with them. The other, for me, very interesting is that in Poland, in the interwar period, education was mandatory for boys and for girls through 8th grade. In many Jewish families, they chose to send their sons to Jewish schools, but their daughters, usually to save on tuition, they sent to public school. And so you developed this group of women who were more assimilated. Jewish women were, they had many Catholic friends. They understood Christian mores and habits. And look at me, even in the Zoom screen, I'm gesticulating. So that was considered very Jewish. And one woman writes about how when she went out on missions, she wore a muff to control her gesticulations. They had you know, how many times a week you brushed your teeth. That was different if you were Jewish or if you were Catholic. And they had a nuanced understanding of these differences because they lived and engaged with Catholics all the time. They also, and this was very important, and they talk about this all the time, they learned to speak Polish like a Pole without the creaky Yiddish accent, they would say. And so even if a Jewish man in the underground had to go on a mission on the outside, he always went with a woman for many reasons, but mainly so she could talk. She bought the train tickets. She arranged the room. She ordered, you know, whatever. She did the talking because his accent would give him away. On top of all that, women weren't suspected. You know, Nazi culture was, you know, classically sexist. Why would this beautiful young woman be carrying a revolver in a teddy bear? And they played to this all the time. Some of my favorite stories in their accounts in my book are when they call it extreme confidence. You know, they would carrying a bag of contraband material, they go up to a Gestapo agent and say, "It's so heavy, can you carry it for me?" Of course I will. And that kind of coyness, flirtation worked to their advantage. They led them off the track immediately, aggressively. And so for all those reasons, you know, they were better able to do undercover work.
Also, what about you? How did Noor's identity and gender help her resistance efforts? I mean, a lot of this.
Well, She was, as Judy said about her battalion of women, they were unexpected. Noor was unexpected. Let's go back to England for a moment, and then I will jump to France, where she actually served. It took a while for the SOE, the Special Operations Executive in which Noor served, to let women be employed, to let women be sent overseas, and especially to France, because England, like so many other countries of that era, had a very circumscribed vision of what women should do. And the more stodgy fellows who ran the SOE did not want women in their employment. One of them had to go to Winston Churchill himself to gain permission to let women serve. Turned out to be a brilliant strategy because it took the Germans completely unprepared. Maybe 4 or 5 dozen women from the SOE served in France. Noor, of course, was one of them. She had so much to her advantage. One, the Germans did not expect a woman. Two, she was very pretty, and sometimes she was able to use that quasi-seductively and take the Germans off guard. There was one instance where a German soldier came up to her on the metro subway in Paris, and she was lugging around her radio, 30 pounds of equipment, and she often took it with her almost wherever she went. This fellow wanted to know what was in what seemed to be a suitcase. Noor opened it just a crack. She batted her eyelashes, and she said, well, obviously, it's a film projector. And she quickly shut it. She could have been caught on the spot, maybe even executed on the spot. Another time, because she had to string out a 70-foot antenna before she could actually operate the radio, she dangled it out of her window in the apartment building where she was staying. She went downstairs to stretch a tree to tree to tree. She heard a voice behind her saying, "Madam, may I help you?" She turned around and there was an SS officer, and he offered to stretch the antenna for her. I would imagine if that was a guy stringing up a 70-foot antenna, the SS man would not have been so hospitable. But because here's a rather diminutive woman, 5'4", barely 100 pounds, doing this task, he assisted her. Noor later said to a friend, well, maybe he thought I was going to listen to the BBC on my radio. Maybe he dug jazz as much as I did. Probably not. He just saw a woman who needed some assistance, and he was a Nazi gentleman, and he dug right in. And another thing that was in her favor was her accent. It was almost non-placeable. She was born in Russia. She was raised for a while in England. Her mother was American. Her father was Indian, and she was raised mostly in France. She had an accent that nobody could really pinpoint. So in addition to gender, she had a whole bevy of advantages, and that worked to her purposes because she served in the SOE in France for 4 months. The average SOE radio operator lasted 6 weeks.
Wow, yeah. And you describe, both of you describe so vividly these kind of, yeah, wonderful anecdotes in your book, and you everyone must go out and get the book to kind of find the anecdote that speaks mostly to them. I am wondering, I am wondering, Judy, let's go back to you here. Why do you think these kind of overlooked, let's say, or unknown resistance narratives are coming out now? I mean, both of your books are kind of part of a larger trend to re-examine the Second World War through various lenses, whether that be through gender or race or religion, certainly. Why are we turning to these kind of new narratives now, and how does that change the way we perceive the kind of male white World War II period?
Me first? Was
Yes.
that it? Was,
Yeah.
okay. I don't want to do anything wrong. Sure. So, I mean, this is, this sort of flip side question to this is, why haven't we heard these stories for this whole time? And this was like the sub question for all my research. On the one hand, what happened? What's the story? And on the other hand, what happened to this story? How could I from a family of Holocaust survivors, feminists, Jewish, never heard of these women. It didn't make sense. And so I at one point I told my editor this should be the whole book. She did not allow that, but she let me keep in a section at the end where I do deal with this in much more detail. So very quickly, there are a number of reasons why I think we haven't heard this history. Some of it is political, having to do with how the narrative of the Holocaust is shaped by political forces, and often stories of Jewish resistance have been suppressed. Stories of women's experience have been suppressed. And another reason is zeitgeist. At different times, we've been interested in different elements of the Holocaust and uncomfortable discussing different elements of the Holocaust. And to answer your question more directly, I think lately we've been in a moment where we are more interested in women's experience in the Holocaust. But I think a lot of this has to do with the personal. And the fact that many of these women did not tell their story, or they told it right away and then they kept it quiet until much more recently. Sometimes this is because they were not believed. Many of them talk about there was a sort of idea that, and this is in the 40s and 50s, that, the pure souls perished in the Holocaust. But if you survived, it's because you did something conniving, you were a collaborator, you slept your way to safety. These women felt guilty that they had fled from their families to fight and their families had been killed. They suffered survivor's guilt after the war so pungently. They, one woman, Hasia Bielika, she was worked in Bialystok, ran a ring of 18 Jewish women undercover, transported weapons from anti-Nazi Germans to the forest to help the Russian partisans, did missions for the Red Army to help them liberate Bialystok. And she felt that she, compared to her fellow survivors who'd been through Auschwitz, she hadn't had it that bad. She felt she almost didn't merit telling her story. Many of these women, they were so young, they were 18, 19, 20 during the war. When the war was over, those who survived, they had their whole lives ahead of them, and they had nothing. They had no family, no country, no nationality, no home. They were refugees in places where they didn't even speak the language. And it was so important for them to start over, to start fresh, to have children, to repopulate the Jewish people. And they wanted to raise their children in more happy, normal lives. And for all these reasons, they didn't tell their story often until much later in their lives, until grandchildren were asking about it, until they realized they would soon die. And those testimonies weren't left that long ago. And I think that historians like myself now, we're using that material to tell this story. And that's why those are the reasons I think this is coming out now.
Thank you, wonderful. So yeah, from the Holocaust to the French Resistance, Arthur, what about you? Why do you think?
So many factors entwined in that one question. We could go on for days, but we're not going to. Obviously, because Noor was a woman, and men fight wars, women don't. Women's stories throughout history have been secondary to men's. Noor was a woman, we know that. Noor was a Sufi, and Sufism is closely associated with Islam. And that's another reason why Noor's story was so ignored in the West for so long. Within a certain circumscribed community, the Sufi community, she was known, she was celebrated, she was venerated. In the broader community, she was ignored and she was unknown. Women have been considered ciphers, negligible, discardable. And Noor was anything But Noor was as brave as any man the SOE sent to France. She was as brave as any member of the French resistance. And it's really a pity for all the rest of us that we have not been exposed to stories like Noor's, to stories that Judy talks about, because these tales broaden who we are as human beings, not just as Sufis, not just as Jewish women in Poland, but who we are as humanity. And one last thing about humanity, Noor's father taught her to look at humanity without thinking they are German or English or French. They are equally dear, he said, to the awakened soul. To them, Judgment Day does not come after death. For them, every day is a judgment day. Without thinking the German or English or French. Noor made no distinction between these. I don't think she was fighting the Germans or fighting for the English or fighting for the French. I think Noor was fighting for humanity. She was nurturing humanity and assisting humanity and helping it be a better humanity.
I'm curious, I'm glad that you quoted Noor's father there, because I was just about to quote him from your book, Arthur. I mean, his poetry and his writings come up again and again so beautifully, as well as Noor's own poetry. And I was so moved, actually, both of the endings of your books, Judy, with your kind of personal account, and then Arthur with your description of this kind of mingling of souls. Can you explain this idea of the mingling of souls? And then I want to ask both of you, once you have explained what it was like to spend time mingling your soul with souls.
Okay, I'll mingle for a second. By mingling of souls, you're referring to the Sufi idea of afterlife?
Yeah.
Okay. Which I think is just an exquisite concept that I had never encountered before. You know, this was articulated by Noor's father, Hazrat Inayat Khan. He's a man who taught his children, taught his followers, do not isolate yourself from humanity. Your mission, your purpose in living is to serve others. The true spirituality, he said, lies in serving those next to you. So service, helping others, aiding others however she could, was what Noor was about. It's what Sufism is all about. But that did not terminate with death on this plane. Hazrat Inayat Khan taught that after we die, our souls rise and rise and rise until eventually we reach God, if indeed you believe in God. But they were only able to rise by being of service even after death. As souls rise, their gifts, their talents, their knowledge are transferred to new souls that are descending. That's why I think Noor was able to encapsulate sacrifice as a joy. She knew other sacrifices lay ahead of her. And the best sacrifices are those that aid others and illuminate others' being and personalities and existence.
Thank you for that wonderful summary. So Judy, following that kind of conception of the Sufism afterlife, what was it like for you to kind of mingle, as it were, with these old souls? What kind of traits transferred to you? What were you struck by? What stayed with you, in other words, in the afterlife of your book?
Oh my goodness, I'm not sure I've ever been asked that before. You know, the first thing that comes to mind, I feel it now that this is very beautiful, Arthur, and very emotional. And you know, there's an element, you know, of course, some of the women in my story survived, and I write about them, and some did not survive. And I very often, in some ways, felt so responsible to those who did not survive. I really feel like the granddaughter, they were never able to have. Someone like Frumka Plotnicka was a leader in the Warsaw Ghetto. They called her Die Mame, the mother. She traveled the country. She gave lectures. These are in ghettos as a Jew. She gave lectures and seminars and brought news and did research, and then was the first person to smuggle weapons into the Warsaw Ghetto. She brought 2 guns in a sack of potatoes. She ran the underground in Beijing. She died fighting, gun in her hand, shooting Nazis. She was awarded a medal from the interim Polish government at the time for her military service. And I don't think anyone has heard of her, certainly not in popular culture. And I feel so, I felt, in some ways this book was a labor of love, but it was also a labor of duty. If I don't tell Frumka Plotnicka's story, who will? And so I feel very connected to these women who've lived in my head for a long time. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
yeah, lovely.
Okay.
Lovely. Arthur, what about you?
Okay, Judy, I agree with you. Writing about Noor was duty, in a sense. I had to. I was compelled to write this book, even though she came to me entirely accidentally and fortuitously. But I will defer just for a moment to Noor's father, because he had some very wise words about duty. He said, consider duty as sacred as religion. You and I have been enormously devoted to our characters, to our historical beings with which we have absorbed ourselves. And I bet, well, I'll speak for myself, and to a very large degree, have taken over my life. I was about to say, I bet all your women have taken over your life. I know this one woman has taken over my life. And it's been an honor to meet Noor. And it's been an honor and a treat be affected, hopefully positively, by Noor. There was one instance that I talk about in my book where several members of the resistance in France said that another member had betrayed Noor to the Gestapo. And they told them exactly how this fellow could possibly have done that. And Noor refused to believe them. She said, no, 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 not this fellow. Not him, and don't you dare judge him. We cannot judge anybody else. We can only judge ourselves. And if you judge others, most likely you are going to be wrong. So Noor, even while she was staying one step ahead of the Gestapo, refused to be wrong. I have learned from Noor to forgive others and not to judge them. About a year and a half ago, somebody I'm very close to completely disregarded the very, very wise advice I gave her. I didn't talk to her for 2 or 3 days. And then I remembered Noor forgiving this fellow who others said had betrayed her. And if Noor could forgive this member of the resistance, who allegedly was doing something for the Nazis, then surely I could forgive my friend. And one more thing, another time, somebody had done a minor favor for me. And I thanked her. And I thanked her. And I thanked her again. And finally she said, Arthur, that's enough. You have thanked me more than I need to be thanked. And I realized I had learned from Noor to be grateful for even the smallest and perhaps even most negligible of favors. We should all welcome favors wherever they come, and we should all be grateful and express our gratitude.
Lovely. I just want to ask you both one more question before we move to the Q&A. So if you joined us late, you are watching a discussion with Judy Batalion and Arthur Magida about their new books, The Light of Days and Codename Madeline. We're coming to not the end of the event, but the part of the event where you can ask Judy and Arthur your questions or comments. So please, if you haven't already done so, go ahead and post them in the chat and I will read them out for you on your behalf. And if you want to speak to them personally, then do stay on the call for the virtual reception. My final question to both of you is about your research process, which Arthur rolling his eyes. Judy, yeah, let's again start with you. You described the labor of love, 14 years writing this book?
I mean, not every day, but it.
Why not?
Because it was too hard. Because it was too hard. This was not material I was always prepared to deal with. In fact, from that, I found that Yiddish book in the British Library in 2007, and I started seriously writing this book in 2017. There was a 10-year incubation period where I translated that. I was lucky to get a grant to translate that Yiddish book. And again, it was such difficult material. I couldn't work on it all the time. It was very little bits here, little bits there. I think that the university that gave me that grant thought I would never do it. And years later, I did it, but you did. It was really a very difficult, especially at first, difficult emotionally, difficult legit. I was working in so many languages. It was very difficult at first to get my grounding in this project. And I actually at first was writing it as a novel. Then that switched. Then I was going to do it as an academic book. Then that switched. And I went back to a novel. So it really took 10 years until I was moving forward with this as a nonfiction, as a narrative nonfiction book. I don't know what you want to know about my research process, but basically I made lists of every name of every woman I read about, starting with that Yiddish book. I looked them all up in every related archive, library, Holocaust database, and found whatever memoirs and testimonies they'd left. I then read through those, made lists of all the other women that they mentioned, looked at those women up, and started to realize that this was not just 50 women, but hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of women, and that I could probably not research all of them, but picked ones to focus on who I thought showed a diversity of activity, a diversity of background. And you know, for those that did survive, met with their families and tried to understand who they were, what they did, and what they were like during the war. And the last section of my book is entirely after the war. Not just how did they survive, but how did they go on surviving? How did they actively live and choose to live? Who did they become? That was all those years.
Research. It never ended. I'm still researching Noor stories, or Noor is still researching me. I still get stories almost every day about Noor or about her father, Judy Inayat Khan. This may never end, although there will not be a volume 2 of Codename Madeline. When I started, I knew scant details about Sufism. I knew little about French resistance. As I said before, I knew nothing about the SOE, the Special Operations Executive. Incrementally, I became a reasonably educated person about all of this. And I was able to do that because so many people in so many places were generous. Noor's family in The Hague, in Germany, in Richmond, Virginia, opened up their hearts and their resources and their boxes and boxes of material about Noor to me. I went to the Imperial War Museum in London. I went to the National Archive in London. I interviewed Sufis in several different places. It was a labor of love, but also in many ways a labor. Because when you're doing a book, you are besieged on all sides by people who say they can help you, by people who really can't help you, by people who think they know the story better than you ever will, and perhaps they do. And it was a story that really captured me and riveted me. So even in my darkest days, I knew I had to continue, and not just because I had a book contract, but I knew I had to continue because I wanted Noor's story out in the world. And the few times when I flagged, I suppose, as I was writing the book, was when it came time to write about Winston Churchill. For 3 days, I totally froze up. Who am I to write about Winston Churchill? Thousands of books, I'm sure, have been written about Churchill. And finally, walking around one day in my wonderful wooded neighborhood, a few phrases came to my head. That was the beginning of my section about Churchill. I don't think about something, my thinking is way better. And another time when I really froze up was near the end of the book. I knew, of course, at the outset that Noor did not survive the war. I'm being very vague because I want people to read the book and find out what happened to her. But originally, I knew the standard story about what happened to Noor. My own research uncovered 3 other versions of what happened to her. And as I got closer and closer to her end, I began crying because I knew I would have to kill Noor once. I did not want to have to kill Noor 4 times, and I did. That was the most difficult part of the book, and the one that shattered me the most. And if I will, one quote from Noor that actually I love so much, I use it twice in the book on Shattering Your Heart. She said, the heart breaks when reality surrounds us. My heart broke as I was writing this book. Her heart broke as World War II broke out. She knew she had to serve, and I knew I had to serve Noor.
Thank you, Arthur. And thank you, Judy, and thank you for our lovely audience for all of your questions. I'm going to try and get to as many as I can. So let's just jump right in. Suzanne wants to know, and Judy, I think we should go to you first because you spend a kind of whole end chapter on this. Thank you for this fascinating, inspiring talk and for your books. Were you able to work with family members and friends to reconstruct the women's stories? How did you confirm details of their missions and experiences? So I know that you, at the end, describe meeting Renee's family member, Renee, but maybe you can speak a little bit more to this question.
So I met with 20 different families.
Right.
And as Arthur said, every day I'm getting family emails every day from other family members and people related to the underground, and a cousin, and do you know about her? And he said, so there's many more stories out there. I met with about 20 different families, and truthfully, when I met with the families, I wasn't trying to confirm details of their war stories. That wasn't my intention. I wanted to understand who these women were, who they were as mothers, who they were as grandmothers, who they were as, as people. As I said before, not just how they survived, but how they chose to live, how they actively chose to live the rest of their lives after what they'd been through when they were 18, 19 years old. I was interested in, what they literally, what did they like to do all day? What was their favorite food? Were they funny? Were they serious? Were they emotional people? Were they reserved? Did they, I found out some of them loved to take walks, and some of them loved to travel, and some of them hated to travel. And I used those interviews both to complete my chapters for after the war, but also to get a greater understanding of who these characters were, so that I could imbue the earlier chapters with more of their personality, more of a sense of of their psychology, of their motivation, of their being. And you know, I'm so far I haven't had any complaints from families about what's been written, but I you know, so far I did make one mistake, but so far I found in general families have been so grateful that I've told the stories, and very helpful and very supportive.
I'm going to jump to a new question just because, just in the interest of time. So Arthur, I'll pose this one to you. This is I received this privately, so I think people in the chat can't see this. This is from somebody called L. Dunkelman, who thanks both of you for your powerful books beyond words. Are you working on another book, Arthur? Let's start with you, and then Judy, will jump to you. What are you working on now?
What are we working on now? At this very moment, I hope my agent is selling my book, my new proposal. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it does take me back to World War II. It takes me back to Berlin. It's about a fellow in his very early 20s who became the foremost, and Jewish, and hiding in the city of ill repute. And he became the foremost forger in that city for those who needed documents. When he learned in 1943 that the Gestapo was pretty much onto him, he bought a bicycle on the black market and spent 2 or 3 weeks biking from Berlin straight through Nazi Germany to Switzerland, with lots of very close calls along the way.
Great. Judy, what about you?
Well, so first of all, I'm working on the screenplay of this book. It's not me myself, I'm co-writing it with a screenwriter, but that is something we're actively doing right now. And then I was telling you before the Zoom, it's funny, I literally had a meeting with my agent yesterday where I came in with a whole list of ideas that had nothing to do with World War II, and walked out of the meeting thinking, oh, I guess I'm going to write about World War II again with new World War II ideas. I actually am very, very interested in, it's not quite World War II, is Warsaw and Poland in the 1930s, a period of incredible cultural production, a golden age for Jewish culture that has really been underreported and, you know, eclipsed, of course, by what happened next. But it was, to me, I became very obsessed with this time period of tremendous poetic literature. There were 180 Jewish newspapers in Warsaw alone. And I think I might be revisiting that period in my next project.
Fantastic. I think we have time for one more question, so we'll keep it brief. This is from Dr. Vivian V. Click, who writes, you have both written about women whose stories came to you serendipitously. Do you both feel as a society, as writers, that women's negligibility, secondariness will be increasingly overcome as we discover and tell these stories? And if so, how best to discover these stories?
Good question, especially since Noor came to me accidentally. How best to discover them? Hopefully, and obviously, by reading the 2 books we're talking about today, but to broaden that, hopefully as well, each story leads to another. Judy was just doing a wonderful example of that by telling us when she met with different families, she learned different things, and she learned about other relatives or other people who were heroes and or heroines during the Second World War. One strand is not isolated from the other. So I encourage everybody out there, no holds barred, from doing your own research and spending hours in various archives and libraries. And don't be shy about talking to anybody who is alive, who may have known any of these people, or is alive and may have known of any of these people. One of the people I interviewed, in fact, was Noor's sister-in-law, Mary. She was 90, and I had been warned, don't don't spend any time with Mary. Her mind isn't quite intact, but I had an opportunity to meet her. I spent about 45 minutes very kindly and gingerly interviewing her, and I posed her a question. How do you explain Noor's journey from a young woman who wrote about fairies to a young woman who fought Nazis? And Mary paused for a moment. She said, Noor always believed in the unbelievable. And as soon as I heard that, I thought, thank you, Mary. You just gave me the last sentence of my book, and indeed it is. So look for opportunities, meet with people, don't be shy. They want you to hear what they know and what they've lived, or what they know and they've heard from others who did live this.
Fantastic. And just before Judy answers the question, will be the final answer of the evening, I've just posted all of the links that you need to buy the books, either in the US, so there's the HarperCollins link of Judy's book, there's the Norton link of Arthur's book, and if you're in Paris, I encourage you to go to the Red Wheelbarrow bookstore, which specifically ordered copies of both of these books. And I believe that there's some kind of special code that you can use to buy 15% off Arthur's book. I'll put this all in the email tomorrow, but if you're really wanting to get this now, get it now. So Judy, finally over to you. How do we recuperate women's stories from history?
Small question.
Small question.
No pressure. Final question. What's the answer? I mean, you know, I mean, you just have to read and write and go to libraries and talk to people. I mean, and write about them. I can't, I don't know that there is a method. That's why doing research is hard. You don't know. You don't start with an answer. You start with a question and you go look for what you're looking for. And it is disconcerting. You don't know what you'll find. It might not work. But I'll just end. I had a very similar experience to Arthur in that the only woman I talked to who herself had been, she was a partisan in Vilna. This was the one person I talked to directly she's no longer alive. It was a couple of years ago. She was about 100 at the time. And it's same thing. Her son was like, oh, it's not worth it. It's not going to work. She's too old. She's confused. And I said, you know, I'd like to try just talking to her. And we did it on Skype, and because she was in Florida in a nursing home. And we spoke in Yiddish. And it's true, I didn't get very many details from her. I didn't get narrative coherence, but she ended the conversation and said to me, Judy, you must tell the world, we must work together for harmony. We must be compassionate. We must collaborate. We must work towards peace. And, you know, these women who were fighters and guerrilla fight, they were so compassionate. So many of them, like my grandmother too, they really, you know, dedicated themselves to a life of service and of compassion and of helping others, both professionally and personally. And I too used her line as the end of my book. So we both got our last lines from these unexpected interviews.
Will you just both hold up your books so we can see them, since I don't have...
This is the American cover.
Is that what you wish?
Well,
Here we are. This is paperback. Cover is different, and I believe better than hardback. We worked really hard on refining what we wanted to say.
Lovely, lovely.
This is also